Welcome, dreamer. Before we begin tonight's gentle journey into rest, I want to take just a moment to thank you for being here. If you enjoy these calming sleep stories and they help bring peace to your nights, please consider supporting the channel by liking this video, subscribing, or sharing it with someone you care about. Your support helps keep this cozy space glowing for all who need it. Now, let's settle in. Take a deep breath in and exhale slowly. Let the day begin to melt away. You're safe here. You're held. And you don't have to do anything except relax. Tonight, we'll drift into a world where starlight dances across a quiet lake, where the air is cool and clean, and the only sound is the soft ripple of water beneath your boat. With every breath, we'll go deeper into stillness, gently floating, gently dreaming. Let's begin tonight's bedtime stories. "I remember," said Mrs. Over-the-Way. "Old as I am, I remember distinctly many of the unrecognized vexations, longings, and disappointments of childhood. By unrecognized, I mean those vexations, longings, and disappointments which could not be understood by nurses, are not confided even to mothers, and through which, even in our cradles, we become subject to that law of humanity which gives to every heart its own secret bitterness to be endured alone. These are they which sometimes outlive weightier memories and produce lifelong impressions disproportionate to their value, but oftener, perhaps, are washed away by the advancing tide of time, the vexations, longings, and disappointments of the next period of our lives. These are they which are apt to be forgotten too soon to benefit our children, and which in the forgetting make childhood all bright to look back upon, and foster that happy fancy that there is one division of mortal life in which greedy desire, unfulfilled purpose, envy, sorrow, weariness, and satiety have no part, by which every man believes himself at least to have been happy as a child. My childhood, on the whole, was a very happy one. The story that I am about to relate is only a fragment of it. As I look into the fire, and the hot coals shape themselves into 1,000 memories of the past, I seem to be staring with childish eyes at a board that stares back at me out of a larch plantation and gives notice that this house is to let. Then, again, I seem to peep through rusty iron gates at the house itself, an old red house with large windows, through which one could see the white shutters that were always closed. To look at this house, though only with my mind's eye, recalls the feeling of mysterious interest with which I looked at it 50 years ago, and brings back the almost oppressive happiness of a certain day, when Sarah, having business with the couple who kept the empty manor, took me with her and left me to explore the grounds whilst she visited her friends. next to a companion with that rare sympathy of mind to mind, that exceptional coincidence of tastes, which binds some few friendships in a chain of mesmeric links, supplanting all the complacencies of love by intuition, is a companion whose desires and occupations are in harmony, if not in unison, with one's own. That friend whom the long patience of the angler does not chafe, the protracted pleasures of the sketcher do not weary, because time flies as swiftly with him whilst he pores over his book, or devoutly seeks botanical specimens through the artist's middle distance. That friend, in short, that valuable friend, who is blessed with the great and good quality of riding a hobby of his own, and the greater and better quality of allowing other people to ride theirs. I did not think out all this 50 years ago, neither were the tastes of that excellent housemaid Sarah quite on a level with those of which I have spoken. But I remember feeling the full comfort of the fact that Sarah's love for friendly gossip was quite as ardent as mine for romantic discovery, that she was disposed to linger quite as long to chat as I to explore, and that she no more expected me to sit wearily through her kitchen confidences than I imagined that she would give a long afternoon to sharing my daydreams in the gardens of the deserted manor. We had ridden our respective hobbies till nearly tea-time before she appeared. "I'm afraid you must be tired of waiting, Miss Mary," said she. "Tired," I exclaimed, "not in the least. I have been so happy, and I am so much obliged to you, Sarah." Need I say why I was so happy that afternoon? Surely most people have felt, at least in childhood, the fascination of deserted gardens, uninhabited houses, ruined churches. They have that advantage over what is familiar and in use that undiscovered regions have over the comfortable one that the traveler leaves to explore them, that the secret which does not concern me has over the facts which do, that what we wish for has over what we possess. If you, my dear, were to open one of those drawers and find nurse's Sunday dress folded up in the corner, it would hardly amuse you. But if instead thereof you found a dress with a long stiff bodice, square at the neck, and ruffled round the sleeves, such as you have seen in old pictures, no matter how old or useless it might be, it would shed round it an atmosphere of delightful and mysterious speculations. This curiosity, these fancies, roused by the ancient dress whose wearer has passed away, are awakened equally by empty houses where someone must once have lived, though his place knows him no more. It was so with the manor. How often had I peeped through the gates, catching sight of garden walks, and wondering whither they led, and who had walked in them, seeing that the shutters behind one window were partly open, and longing to look in. Today I had been in the walks and peeped through the window. This was the happiness. Through the window I had seen a large hall with a marble floor and broad stone stairs winding upwards into unknown regions. By the walks I had arrived at the locked door of the kitchen garden, at a small wood or wilderness of endless delights, including a broken swing, and at a dilapidated summer house. I had wandered over the spongy lawn, which was cut into a long green promenade by high-clipped yew hedges, walking between which, in olden times, the ladies grew erect and stately, as plants among brushwood stretch up to air and light. Finally, I had brought away such relics as it seemed to me that honesty would allow. I had found half a rusty pair of scissors in the summer house. Perhaps some fair lady of former days had lost them here, and swept distractedly up and down the long walks seeking them. Perhaps they were a present, and she had given a luck penny for them, lest they should cut love. Sarah said the housekeeper might have dropped them there, but Sarah was not a person of sentiment. I did not show her the marble I found by the hedge, the acorn I picked up in the park, nor a puny pansy which, halfway back to a wild heartsease, had touched me as a pathetic memorial of better days. When I got home, I put the scissors, the marble, and the pansy into a box. The acorn I hung in a bottle of water. It was to be an oak tree. Properly speaking, I was not at home just then, but on a visit to my grandmother and a married aunt without children who lived with her. A fever had broken out in my own home, and my visit here had been prolonged to keep me out of the way of infection. I was very happy and comfortable except for one single vexation, which was this. I slept on a little bed in what had once been the nursery, a large room which was now used as a workroom. A great deal of sewing was done in my grandmother's house, and the sewing maid and at least one other of the servants sat there every evening. A red silk screen was put before my bed to shield me from the candlelight, and I was supposed to be asleep when they came upstairs. But I never remember to have been otherwise than wide awake, nervously awake, wearily awake. This was the vexation. I was not a strong child and had a very excitable brain, and the torture that it was to hear those maids gossiping on the other side of the dim red light of my screen I cannot well describe, but I do most distinctly remember. I tossed till the clothes got hot, and threw them off till I got cold, and stopped my ears, and pulled the sheet over my face, and tried not to listen, and listened in spite of all. They told long stories, and made many jokes that I couldn't understand. Sometimes I heard names that I knew, and fancied I had learnt some wonderful secret. Sometimes, on the contrary, I made noises to intimate that I was awake, when one of them would rearrange my glaring screen and advise me to go to sleep. And then they talked in whispers, which was more distracting still. One evening, some months after my ramble round the manor, the maids went out to tea, and I lay in peaceful silence watching the shadows which crept noiselessly about the room as the fire blazed, and wishing Sarah and her colleagues nothing less than a month of uninterrupted tea parties. I was almost asleep when Aunt Harriet came into the room. She brought a candle, put up my screen, the red screen again, and went to the work table. She had not been rustling with the work things for many minutes when my grandmother followed her and shut the door with an air which seemed to promise a long stay. She also gave a shove to my screen, and then the following conversation began. "I have been to Lady Sutfield's today, Harriet." "Indeed, ma'am." But my aunt respectfully continued her work, as I could hear by the scraping of the scissors along the table. "I heard some news there. The manor is let." I almost jumped in my bed, and Aunt Harriet's scissors paused. "Let, ma'am, to whom?" "To a Mrs. Moss. You must have heard me speak of her. I knew her years ago when we were both young women. Anastasia Eden she was then." I could hear my aunt move to the fire and sit down. "The beautiful Miss Eden? Whom did she marry at last? Was there not some love affair of hers that you knew about?" "Her love affairs were endless. But you mean Mr. Sandford. She treated him very ill, very ill." There was a pause while the fire crackled in the silence, and then, to the infinite satisfaction of my curiosity, Aunt Harriet said, "I've forgotten the story, ma'am. He was poor, was he not?" "He had quite enough to marry on," my grandmother answered energetically. "But he was not a great match. It was an old story, my dear. The world, the world, the world. I remember sitting up with Anastasia after a ball, where he had been at her side all the evening. We sipped hot posset and talked of our partners. Ah, dear." And here my grandmother heaved a sigh, partly perhaps because of the follies of youth, and partly perhaps because youth had gone and could come back no more. "Anastasia talked of him," she continued. "I remember her asking me if her man were not a pretty fellow, and if he had not sweet blue eyes and the greatest simplicity I ever knew but in a child. It was true enough, and he was a great deal more than that, a great deal more than she ever understood. Poor Anastasia. I advised her to marry him, but she seemed to look on that as impossible. I remember her saying that it would be different if she were not an acknowledged beauty, but it was expected that she would marry well, and he was comparatively poor and not even singular. He was accomplished, and the soul of honor, but simple, provokingly simple, with no pretensions to carry off the toast of a county. My dear, if he had been notorious in any way, for dissipation, for brawling, for extravagance, I believe it would have satisfied the gaping world, and he would have had a chance. But there was nothing to talk about, and Anastasia had not the courage to take him for himself. She had the world at her feet, and paid for it by being bound by its opinion. Here my grandmother, who was apt to moralize, especially when relating biographies of young ladies, gave another sigh. "Then why did she encourage him?" inquired Aunt Harriet, who also moralized, but with more of indignation and less of philosophy. "I believe she loved him in spite of herself, but at the last, when he offered, she turned prudent and refused him." Poor man. Did he ever marry? Yes, and very happily. A charming woman. But the strange part of the story is that he came quite unexpectedly into a large property that was in his family. Did he? Then he would have been as good a match as most of her admirers. Better, it was a fine estate. Poor Anastasia. Serve her right, said my aunt shortly. She was very beautiful, my grandmother gently recommenced. She said this, not precisely as an excuse, but with something of the sort in her tone. Very beautiful. How stately she did look that night, to be sure. She did not paint, and her complexion, a shade too high by day, was perfection by candlelight. I can see her now, my dear, as she stood up for a minuet with him. We wore hoops then, and she had a white brocade petticoat embroidered with pink rosebuds, and a train and bodice of pea-green satin, and green satin shoes with pink heels. You never saw anything more lovely than that brocade. A rich old aunt had given it to her. The shades of the rosebuds were exquisite. I embroidered the rosebuds on that salmon-colored cushion downstairs from a piece that Anastasia gave me as a pattern. Dear me, what a dress it was, and how lovely she looked in it. Her eyes were black, a thing you rarely see, and they shone and glittered under her powdered hair. She had a delicately curved nose, splendid teeth, too, and showed them when she smiled. Then such a lovely throat and beautifully shaped arms. I don't know how it is, my dear Harriet, added my grandmother thoughtfully, but you don't see the splendid women nowadays that there were when I was young. There are plenty of pretty, lively girls, rather too lively in my old-fashioned judgment, but not the real stately beauty that it was worth a 20-mile drive there and back, just to see at one of the old county balls. My aunt sniffed, partly from a depressing consciousness of being one of a degenerate generation, and of a limited experience in the matter of county balls, partly also to express her conviction that principle is above beauty. She said, "Then Miss Eden married, ma'am?" "Yes, rather late, Mr. Moss, a wealthy Indian merchant, I believe. She lost all her children, I know, one after another, and then he died. Poor Anastasia, it seems like yesterday, and to think she should be coming here." My grandmother sighed again, and I held my breath, hoping for some further particulars of the lovely heroine of this romance. But I was disappointed. My uncle's voice at this moment called loudly from below, and Aunt Harriet hurried off with a conscious meritoriousness about her, becoming a lady who had married the right man, and took great care of him. "Supper, ma'am, I think," she said as she left the room. My grandmother sat still by the fire, sighing gently now and then, and I lay making up my mind to brave all and tell her that I was awake. In the first place, although I was not intentionally eavesdropping and my being awake was certainly not my fault, I felt rather uneasy at having overheard what I knew was not intended for my hearing. Besides this, I wanted to hear some more stories of the lovely Mrs. Moss, and to ask how soon she would come to the manor. After a few seconds, my grandmother rose and toddled across the room. I made an effort and spoke just above my breath. "Granny," but my grandmother was rather deaf. Moreover, my voice may have been drowned in the heavy sigh with which she closed the nursery door. The room was empty again. The glare of the red screen was tenderly subdued in the firelight. But for all this, I did not go to sleep. I took advantage of my freedom to sit up in bed, toss my hair from my forehead, and clasping my knees with my arms to rock myself and think. My thoughts had one object. My whole mind was filled with one image, Mrs. Moss. The future inhabitant of my dear deserted manor would, in any circumstances, have been an interesting subject for my fancies. The favored individual whose daily walk might be between the yew hedges on that elastic lawn, who should eat, drink, and sleep through the commonplace hours of this present time behind those mystical white shutters. But when the individual added to this felicitous dispensation of fortune the personal attributes of unparalleled beauty and pea-green satin, of having worn hoops, high heels, and powder, of countless lovers and white brocade with pink rosebuds, well might I sit, my brain whirling with anticipation as I thought, "She is coming here, I shall see her." For though, of course, I knew that having lived in those, so to speak, prehistoric times when my grandmother was young, Mrs. Moss must now be an old woman. Yet, strange as it may seem, my dear, I do assure you that I never realized the fact. I thought of her as I had heard of her, young and beautiful, and modeled my hopes accordingly. Most people's daydreams take sooner or later a selfish turn. I seemed to identify myself with the beautiful Anastasia. I thought of the ball as one looks back to the past. I fancied myself moving through the minuet de la cour, whose stately paces scarcely made the silken rosebuds rustle. I rejected en masse countless suitors of fabulous wealth and nobility, but when it came to Mr. Sandford, I could feel with Miss Eden no more. My grandmother had said that she loved him, that she encouraged him, and that she gave him up for money. It was a mystery. In her place, I thought, I would have danced every dance with him. I would have knitted for him in winter and gathered flowers for him in the summer hedges. To whom should one be most kind, if not to those whom one most loves? To love and take pleasure in giving pain, to balance a true heart and clear blue eyes against money and prefer money, was not at that time comprehensible by me. I pondered and, so to speak, spread out the subject before my mind and sat in judgment upon it. Money, that is, golden guineas, my grandmother had given me one on my birthday. Crowns, shillings, sixpences, pennies, halfpennies, farthings. And when you come to consider how many things a guinea judiciously expended in a toy shop will procure, you see that money is a great thing, especially if you have the full control of it and are not obliged to spend it on anything useful. On the other hand, those whom you love and who love you, not in childhood, thank God, the smallest part of one's acquaintance. I made a list on my own account. It began with my mother and ended with my yellow cat. It included a crusty old gardener who was at times, especially in the spring, so particularly cross that I might have been tempted to exchange him for the undisputed possession of that stock of seeds, tools, and flower pots which formed our chief subject of dispute. But this is a digression. I took the lowest. Could I part with Sandy Tom for any money, or for anything that money could buy? I thought of a speaking doll, a miniature piano, a tiny carriage drawn by 4 yellow mastiffs, of a fairy purse that should never be empty, with all that might thereby be given to others or kept for oneself. And then I thought of Sandy Tom, of his large, round, soft head, his fine eyes. They were yellow, not blue, and glared with infinite tenderness, his melodious purr, his expressive whiskers, his incomparable tail. Love rose up as an impulse, an instinct. It would not be doubted, it utterly refused to be spread out to question. Oh, puss, I thought, if you could but leap onto the bed at this moment, I would explain it all to our mutual comprehension and satisfaction. My dear Sandy, I would say, with you to lie on the cushioned seat, a nice little carriage and 4 yellow mastiffs would be perfection. But as to comparing what I love, to wit, you, Sandy, with what I want, to wit, 4 yellow mastiffs and a great many other things besides, I should as soon think of cutting off your tail to dust the doll's house with. Alas, Sandy Tom was at home. I could only imagine the gentle rub of the head with which he would have assented. Meanwhile, I made up my mind firmly on one point. My grandmother was wrong. Miss Anastasia Eden had not loved Mr. Sanford. Smash! The fire, which had been gradually becoming hollow, fell in at this moment, and I started to find myself chilly and cramped, and so lay down. Then my thoughts took another turn. I wondered if I should grow up beautiful, like Mrs. Moss. It was a serious question. I had often looked at myself in the glass, but I had a general idea that I looked much like other little girls of my age. I began gravely to examine myself in detail, beginning from the top of my head. My hair was light and cropped on a level with the lobes of my ears. This, however, would amend itself with time, and I had long intended that my hair should be of raven blackness and touch the ground at least. But that will not be till I am grown up, thought I. Then my eyes, they were large. In fact, the undue proportions they assumed when I looked ill or tired formed a family joke. If size were all that one requires in eyes, mine would certainly pass muster. Moreover, they had long, curly lashes. I fingered these slowly and thought of Sandy's whiskers. At this point, I nearly fell asleep, but roused myself to examine my nose. My grandmother had said that Mrs. Moss's nose was delicately curved. Now, it is certainly true that a curve may be either concave or convex, but I had heard of the bridge of a nose, and knew well enough which way the curve should go, and I had a shrewd suspicion that if so very short a nose as mine, with so much and so round a tip, could be said to be curved at all, the curve went the wrong way. At the same time, I could not feel sure. For I must tell you that to lie in a comfortable bed, at an hour long beyond the time when one ought naturally to be asleep and to stroke one's nose, is a proceeding not favorable to forming a clear judgment on so important a point as one's personal appearance. The very shadows were still as well as silent. The fire had ceased to flicker. A delicious quietude pervaded the room as I stroked my nose and dozed and stroked my nose, and lost all sense of its shape, and fancied it a huge lump growing under my fingers. The extreme unpleasantness of this idea just prevented my falling asleep, and I roused myself and sat up again. It's no use feeling, I thought. I'll look in the glass. There was one mirror in the room. It hung above the mantelpiece. It was old, deeply framed in dark wood, and was so hung as to slope forwards into the room. In front of the fire stood an old-fashioned cushioned armchair, with a very high back and a many-frilled chintz cover. A footstool lay near it. It was here that my grandmother had been sitting. I jumped out of bed, put the footstool into the chair that I might get to a level with the glass, and climbed onto it. Thanks to the slope of the mirror, I could now see my reflection as well as the dim firelight would permit. What a silly child, you will say, Ida. Very silly indeed, my dear. And how one remembers one's follies. At the end of half a century, I recall my reflection in that old nursery mirror more clearly than I remember how I looked in the glass before which I put on my bonnet this evening to come to tea with you. The weird, startled glance of my eyes which, in their most prominent stage of weariness, gazed at me out of the shadows of the looking-glass, the tumbled tufts of hair, the ghostly effect of my white night-dress. As to my nose, I could absolutely see nothing of its shape. The firelight just caught the round tip, which shone like a little white toadstool from the gloom, and this was all. One can't see the shape, full face, I thought. If I had only another looking-glass. But there was not another. I knew it, and yet involuntarily looked round the room. Suddenly I exclaimed aloud, "Mr. Joseph will do." Who was Mr. Joseph, you will ask? My dear Ida, I really do not know. I have not the least idea. I had heard him called Mr. Joseph, and I fancy he was a connection of the family. All I knew of him was his portrait, a silhouette, elegantly glazed and framed in black wood, which hung against the nursery wall. I was ignorant of his surname and history. I had never examined his features, but I knew that happily he had been very stout, since his ample coat and waistcoat, cut out in black paper, converted the glass which covered them into an excellent mirror for my dolls. Worthy Mr. Joseph, here he was coming in useful again. How much we owe to our forefathers. I soon unhooked him, and climbing back into the chair, commenced an examination of my profile by the process of double reflection, but all in vain. Whether owing to the dusty state of the mirror, or to the dim light, or to the unobliging shapeliness of Mr. Joseph's person, I cannot say, but turn and twist as I would, I could not get a view of my profile sufficiently clear and complete to form a correct judgment upon. I held Mr. Joseph, now high, now low. I stooped, I stood on tiptoe, I moved forward, I leant backward. It was this latest maneuver that aggravated the natural top-heaviness of the chair and endangered its balance. The forelegs rose. My spasmodic struggle was made in the wrong direction, and I, the armchair, and Mr. Joseph fell backwards together. Two of us were light enough, and happily escaped unhurt. It was the armchair which fell with such an appalling crash, and whether it were any the worse or no, I could not tell as it lay. As soon as I had a little recovered from the shock, therefore, I struggled to raise it, whilst Mr. Joseph lay helplessly upon the ground, with his waistcoat turned up to the ceiling. It was thus that my aunt found us. If only Mr. Joseph and I had fallen together, no one need have been the wiser. But that lumbering armchair had come down with a bump that startled the sober trio at supper in the dining room below. "What is the matter?" said Aunt Harriet. I was speechless. "What have you been doing?" I couldn't speak, but accumulating misfortune was gradually overpowering me, and I began to cry. "Get into bed," said Aunt Harriet. I willingly obeyed, and Aunt Harriet seated herself at the foot. "Now, think before you speak, Mary," she said quietly, "and then tell me the truth. What have you been doing?" One large tear rolled over my nose and off the tip as I feebly began. I got into the chair. "Well?" said Aunt Harriet. "To look in the glass." "What for?" said Aunt Harriet. Tears flowed unrestrainedly over my face as I howled in self-abasement. To look at the shape of my nose. At this point Aunt Harriet rose and, turning her back rather abruptly, crossed the room and picked up Mr. Joseph. I have since had reason to believe that she was with difficulty concealing a fit of laughter. "What have you had this picture down for?" she inquired, still with her back to me. "I couldn't see," I sobbed, "and I got Mr. Joseph to help me." My aunt made no reply, and, still carefully concealing her face, restored Mr. Joseph to his brass nail with great deliberation. "There is nothing like full confession." I broke the silence. "Aunt Harriet, I was awake when you and Granny were here and heard what you said." "You are a very silly, naughty child," my aunt severely returned. "Why don't you go to sleep when you are sent to bed?" "I can't," I sobbed, "with talking and candles." "You've got the screen," said Aunt Harriet, and I cannot tell why, but somehow I lacked courage to say that the red screen was the chief instrument of torture. "Well, go to sleep now," she concluded, "and be thankful you're not hurt. You might have killed yourself." Encouraged by the gracious manner in which she tucked me up, I took a shortcut to the information which I had failed to attain through Mr. Joseph. "Aunt Harriet," I said, "do you think I shall ever be as beautiful as Mrs. Moss?" "I'm ashamed of you," said Aunt Harriet. I climbed no more into the treacherous armchair. I eschewed the mirror. I left Mr. Joseph in peace upon the wall. I took no further trouble about the future prospects of my nose. But night and day I thought of Mrs. Moss. I found the old cushion and sat by it, gazing at the faded tints of the rosebuds, till I imagined the stiff brocade in all its beauty and freshness. I took a vigorous drawing fit, but it was only to fill my little book with innumerable sketches of Mrs. Moss. My uncle lent me his paint box, as he was wont, and if the fancy portraits that I made were not satisfactory even to myself, they failed in spite of cheeks blushing with vermilion, in spite of eyes as large and brilliant as lamp-black could make them, and in spite of the most accurately curved noses that my pencil could produce. The amount of gamboge and Prussian blue that I wasted in vain efforts to produce a satisfactory pea green leaves me at this day an astonished admirer of my uncle's patience. At this time I wished to walk along no other road than that which led to my dear manor, where the iron gates were being painted, the garden made tidy, and the shutters opened. But above all, the chief object of my desires was to accompany my grandmother and aunt in their first visit to Mrs. Moss. Once I petitioned Aunt Harriet on this subject. Her answer was, "My dear, there would be nothing to amuse you. Mrs. Moss is an old woman." Granny said she was so beautiful, I suggested. "So she was, my dear, when your grandmother was young." These and similar remarks I heard and heeded not. They did not add one wrinkle to my ideal of Mrs. Moss. They in no way whatever lessened my desire of seeing her. I had never seen my grandmother young, and her having ever been so seemed to me at the most a matter of tradition. On the other hand, Mrs. Moss had been presented to my imagination in the bloom of youth and beauty, and, say what they would, in the bloom of youth and beauty I expected to see her still. One afternoon, about a week after the arrival of Mrs. Moss, I was busy in the garden, where I had been working for an hour or more, when I heard carriage wheels drive up and stop at our door. Could it be Mrs. Moss? I stole gently round to a position where I could see without being seen, and discovered that the carriage was not that of any caller, but my uncle's. Then Granny and Aunt Harriet were going out. I rushed up to the coachman and asked where they were going. He seemed in no way overpowered by having to reply, "To the manor, miss." That was to Mrs. Moss, and I was to be left behind. I stood speechless in bitter disappointment. as my grandmother rustled out in her best silk dress, followed by Aunt Harriet and my uncle, who, when he saw me, exclaimed, "Why, there's my little Mary! Why don't you take her? I'll be bound she wants to go." "I do indeed," I exclaimed in Cinderella-like tones. "But Mrs. Moss is such an old lady," said Aunt Harriet, whose ideas upon children were purely theoretical, and who could imagine no interests for them apart from other children, from toys or definite amusements. What could the child do with herself? "Do," said my uncle, who took a rough and cheery view of life. "Why, look about her to be sure. And if Mrs. M is an old lady, there'll be all the more Indian cabinets and screens and Japan tables and knickknacks and lapdogs. Keep your eyes open, Miss Mary. I've never seen the good lady or her belongings, but I'll stake my best hat on the Japan ware and the lapdog. Now, how soon can you be dressed?" Later in life, the selfish element mixes more largely with our admirations. A few years thence, and in a first interview with the object of so many fancies, I should have thought as much of my own appearance on the occasion as of what I was myself to see. I should have taken some pains with my toilette. At that time, the desire to see Mrs. Moss was too absorbing to admit of any purely personal considerations. I dashed into the nursery, scrubbed my hands and face to a raw red complexion, brushed my hair in 3 strokes, and secured my things with one sweep. I hastily pocketed a pincushion of red cloth, worked with yellow silk spots in the likeness of a strawberry. It was a pet treasure of mine, and I intended it as an offering to Mrs. Moss. I tied my hood at the top of the stairs, fastened my tippet in the hall, and reached the family coach by about 3 of those bounds common to all young animals. "Hullo!" said my uncle, with his face through the carriage door. "You've not thanked me yet." I flung my arms round his starched neckcloth. "You're a darling!" I exclaimed with an emphatic squeeze. "You're another," he replied, returning the embrace upon my hood. With this mutual understanding we parted, and I thought that if Mrs. Moss were not certain to fulfill my ideal, I should have wished her to be as nearly like Uncle James as the circumstances of the case would permit. I watched his yellow waistcoat and waving hands till they could be seen no longer, and then I settled myself primly upon the back seat and ventured upon a shy, conciliating promise to be very good. "You're quite welcome to come, child," said Aunt Harriet. "But as I said, there are neither children nor playthings for you." Children or playthings, what did I want with either? I put my arm through the loop by the window and watched the fields as they came and vanished with vacant eyes, and thought of Mrs. Moss. A dozen times had I gone through the whole scene in my mind before we drove through the iron gates. I fancied myself in the bare, spacious hall at which I had peeped. I seemed to hear a light laugh, and to see the beautiful face of Mrs. Moss look over the banisters, to hear a rustle and the scraping of the stiff brocade as the pink rosebuds shimmered and the green satin shoes peeped out and tap, tap, tap. The high pink heels resounded from the shallow stairs. I had dreamed this daydream many times over before the carriage stopped with a shake, and Aunt Harriet roused me, asking if I were asleep. In another minute or so we were in the hall, and here I met with my first disappointment. To begin with, I had seen the hall unfurnished and had not imagined it otherwise. I had pictured Mrs. Moss in her beauty and rose brocade, the sole ornament of its cold emptiness. Then, though I knew that my grandmother and aunt must both be present, I had really fancied myself the chief character in this interview with Mrs. Moss. I had thought of myself as rushing up the stairs to meet her and laying the pincushion at her green satin feet. And now that at last I was really in the hall, I should not have known it again. It was carpeted from end to end. Fragrant orange trees stood in tubs, large hunting pictures hung upon the walls, below which stood cases of stuffed birds, and over all presided a footman in livery, who himself looked like a stuffed specimen of the human race with unusually bright plumage. No face peeped over the banisters, and when we went upstairs, the footman went first, as seemed due to him, then my grandmother, followed by my aunt, and lastly I, in the humblest insignificance behind them. My feet sank into the soft stair carpets. I vacantly admired the elegant luxury around me, with an odd sensation of heartache. Everything was beautiful, but I had wanted nothing to be beautiful but Mrs. Moss. Already the vision began to fade. That full-fed footman troubled my fancies. His scarlet plush killed the tender tints of the rosebuds in my thoughts, and the streaky powder upon his hair seemed a mockery of the toupee I hoped to see, whose whiteness should enhance the luster of rare black eyes. He opened the drawing-room door and announced my grandmother and aunt. I followed, and, so far as one may be said to face anything when one stands behind the skirts of two intervening elders, I was face to face with Mrs. Moss. That is, I was face to face with a tall, dark old woman with stooping shoulders, a hooked nose, black eyes that smoldered in their sunken sockets, and a distinct growth of beard upon her chin. Mr. Moss had been dead many years, and his widow had laid aside her weeds. She wore a dress of feuille morte satin and a black lace shawl. She had a rather elaborate cap with a tendency to get on one side, perhaps because it would not fit comfortably on the brown front with bunchy curls which was fastened into its place by a band of broad black velvet. And this was Mrs. Moss. This was the end of all my fancies. There was nothing astonishing in the disappointment. The only marvel was that I should have indulged in so foolish a fancy for so long. I had been told more than once that Mrs. Moss was nearly as old as my grandmother. As it was, she looked older. Why, I could not tell then, though I know now. My grandmother, though never a beauty, had a sweet smile of her own, and a certain occasional kindling of the eyes, the outward signs of a character full of sentiment and intelligence, and these had outlasted youth. She had always been what is called pleasing, and she was pleasing still. But in Mrs. Moss no strength, no sentiment, no intellect filled the place of the beauty that was gone. Features that were powerful without character, and eyes that glowed without expression, formed a wreck with little to recall the loveliness that had bewildered Mr. Sandford and me. There is not much more to tell, Ida. This was the disappointment. This is the cause of my dislike for a certain shade of foil mort satin. It disappointed me of that rose brocade which I was never to see. You shall hear how I got through the visit, however. This meeting, which, like so many meetings, had proved the very reverse of what was hoped. Through an angle of Aunt Harriet's pelisse, I watched the meeting between my grandmother and Mrs. Moss. They kissed and then drew back and looked at each other, still holding hands. I wondered if my grandmother felt as I felt. I could not tell. With one of her smiles, she bent forward and, kissing Mrs. Moss again, said, "God bless you, Anastasia. God bless you, Elizabeth." It was the first time Mrs. Moss had spoken, and her voice was rather gruff. Then both ladies sat down, and my grandmother drew out her pocket handkerchief and wiped her eyes. Mrs. Moss began, as I thought, to look for hers, and not finding it, called Metcalf, on which a faded little woman with a forefinger in a faded-looking book came out from behind some window curtains, and, rummaging Mrs. Moss's chair with a practiced hand, produced a large silver snuff-box, from which Mrs. Moss took a pinch, and then offered it to Granny, who shook her head. Mrs. Moss took another and a larger pinch. It was evident what made her voice so gruff. Aunt Harriet was introduced as my daughter Harriet, and made a stiff curtsy as Mrs. Moss smiled and nodded and bade her, "Sit down, my dear." Throughout the whole interview she seemed to be looked upon by both ladies as a child, and played the part so well, sitting prim and silent on her chair, that I could hardly help humming as I looked at her. "Hold up your head, turn out your toes, speak when you're spoken to, mend your clothes." I was introduced, too, as a grandchild, made a curtsy the shadow of Aunt Harriet's, received a nod, the shadow of that bestowed upon her, and got out of the way as soon as I could, behind my aunt's chair, where, coming unexpectedly upon 3 fat pug dogs on a mat, I sat down among them and felt quite at home. The sight of the pugs brought Uncle James to my mind, and when I looked round the room, it seemed to me that he must be a conjurer at least. So true was everything he had said. A large Indian screen hid the door. Japanned boxes stood on a little table to correspond in front of it, and there were 2 cabinets having shallow drawers with decorated handles, and a great deal of glass, through which odd teacups, green dragons, Indian gods, and Dresden shepherdesses were visible upon the shelves. The room was filled with knick-knacks, And here were the pug dogs, no less than 3 of them. They were very fat, and had little beauty except as to their round heads and black wrinkled snouts, which I kissed over and over again. "Do you mind Mrs. Moss's being old and dressing in that hideous brown dress?" I asked in a whisper at the ear of one of these round heads. "Think of the rosebuds on the brocade, and the pea-green satin, and the high-heeled shoes." "Ah," I added, "you are only a pug, and pugs don't think." Nevertheless, I pulled out the pincushion and showed it to each dog in turn, and the sight of it so forcibly reminded me of my vain hopes that I could not help crying. A hot tear fell upon the nose of the oldest and fattest pug, which so offended him that he moved away to another mat at some distance, and as both the others fell fast asleep, I took refuge in my own thoughts. The question arose, why should not Mrs. Moss have the pincushion after all? I had expected her to be young and beautiful, and she had proved old and ugly, it is true. But there is no reason why old and ugly people should not have cushions to keep their pins in. It was a struggle to part with my dear strawberry pincushion in the circumstances, but I had fairly resolved to do so when the rustle of leave-taking began, and I had to come out of my corner. "Bid Mrs. Moss good day, Mary," said my grandmother, and added, "The child has been wild to come and see you, Anastasia." Mrs. Moss held out her hand good-naturedly. "So you wanted to see me, my dear," said she. I took my hand out of my pocket where I had been holding the pincushion and put both into Mrs. Moss's palm. "I brought this for you, ma'am," I said. "It is not a real strawberry. It is emery. I made it myself." And the fact of having sacrificed something for Mrs. Moss made me almost fond of her. Moreover, there was an expression in her eyes at that moment which gave them beauty. She looked at my grandmother and laid her hand on my head. "I lost all mine, Elizabeth." I thought she was speaking of her pincushions, and being in a generous mood, said hastily, "When that is worn out, ma'am, I will make you another." But she was speaking of her children. Poor Mrs. Moss. She took another huge pinch of snuff and called, "Metcalf." The faded little woman appeared once more. "I must give you a keepsake in return, my dear," said Mrs. Moss. "The china pug Metcalf." Metcalf, whose face always wore a smile that looked as if it were just about to disappear, and who, indeed, for that matter, always looked as if she were just about to disappear herself, opened one of the cabinets and brought out a little toy pug in china, very delicately colored, and looking just like one of my friends on the mat. I fell in love with it at once, and it was certainly a handsome exchange for the strawberry pincushion. "You will send the child to see me now and then, Elizabeth?" said Mrs. Moss as we retired. In the end, Mrs. Moss and I became great friends. I put aside my dream among the vain fancies of life and took very kindly to the manor in its new aspect. Even the stuffed footman became familiar and learnt to welcome me with a smile. The real Mrs. Moss was a more agreeable person than I have, I fear, represented her. She had failed to grasp solid happiness in life because she had chosen with the cowardice of an inferior mind. But she had borne disappointment with dignity and submitted to heavy sorrows with patience, and a greater nature could not have done more. She was the soul of good humor and the love of small chat, which contrasted so oddly with her fierce appearance, was a fund of entertainment for me, as I fed my imagination and stored my memory with anecdotes of the good old times and the many quiet evenings we spent together. I learnt to love her more heartily, I confess, when she bought a new gown and gave the fuel mort satin to Mrs. Metcalf. Mrs. Metcalf was humble companion to Mrs. Moss. She was in reality single, but she exacted the married title as a point of respect. At the beginning of our acquaintance I called her Miss Metcalf, and this occasioned the only check our friendship ever received. Now I would, with the greatest pleasure, have addressed her as my Lord Archbishop, or in any other style to which she was not entitled, it being a matter of profound indifference to me. But the question was a serious one to her, and very serious she made it, till I almost despaired of our ever coming to an understanding on the subject. On every other point she was unassuming almost to nonentity. She was weak-minded to the verge of mental palsy. She was more benevolent indeed and more wandering in conversation than anyone I have met with since. That is, in ordinary life. In the greenhouse or garden, with which she and the head gardener alone had any real acquaintance, her accurate and profound knowledge would put to shame many professed garden botanists I have met with since. From her I learnt what little I know of the science of horticulture, and with her I spent many happy hours over the fine botanical works in the Manor Library, which she alone ever opened. And so I became reconciled to things as they were, though to this day I connect with that shade of foil mort satin a disappointment not to be forgotten. "It is a dull story, is it not, Ida?" said the little old lady, pausing here. She had not told it in precisely these words, but this was the sum and substance of it. Ida nodded. Not that she had thought the story dull, so far as she had heard it, and whilst she was awake, but she had fallen asleep, and so she nodded. Mrs. Overthaway looked back at the fire, to which, indeed, she had been talking for some time past. A child's story, she thought. A tale of the blind, wilful folly of childhood? Ah, my soul! Alas, my grown-up friends! Does the moral belong to childhood alone? Have manhood and womanhood no passionate, foolish longings for which we blind ourselves to obvious truth, and of which the vanity does not lessen the disappointment? Do we not still toil after rosebuds to find fuel mort? No voice answered Mrs. Overthaway's fanciful questions. The hyacinth nodded fragrantly on its stalk, and Ida nodded in her chair. She was fast asleep, happily asleep. with a smile upon her face. The shadows nodded gently on the walls, and like a shadow the little old lady stole quietly away. When Ida awoke, she found herself lying partly in the armchair and partly in the arms of Nurse, who was lifting her up. A candle flared upon the table. By the fire stood an empty chair, and the heavy scent that filled the room was as sweet as the remembrance of past happiness. The little old lady had vanished, and, but for the hyacinth, Ida would almost have doubted whether her visit had not been a dream. "Has Mrs. Over-the-Way been long gone, Nursey?" she asked, keeping her eyes upon the flower pot. "Ever so long," said Nurse. "And here you've been snoring away, and the old lady's been downstairs telling me how comfortably you were asleep, and she's coming again tomorrow evening if you're good." It was precisely 12 minutes since Mrs. Over-the-Way left the house, but Nurse was of a slightly exaggerative turn of mind, and few people speak exactly on the subject of time, especially when there is an opportunity of triumphing over someone who has been asleep before bedtime. The condition of Ida's being good was also the work of Nurse's own instructive fancy, but Ida caught eagerly at the welcome news of another visit. "Then she is not angry with me for falling asleep, Nursey. I was so comfortable, and she has such a nice voice I couldn't help it. I think I left off about the pugs. I wish I had a pug with a wrinkled black snout, don't you, Nursey?" "I'm sure I don't, Miss Ida. My father kept all sorts of pigs, and we used to have one with a black snout and black spots. But it was as ugly could be, and I never could fancy the bacon would be fit to eat. You must have been dreaming, I'm sure. The old lady would never tell you about such rubbish, I know." "It's pugs, not pigs, Nursey, and they're dogs, you know," said Ida, laughing. "How funny you are. And indeed she did tell me I couldn't have dreamt it. I never dreamt anything so nice in my life." "And never will, most likely," said Nurse, who was very skillful in concluding a subject which she did not want to discuss, and who was apt to do so by a rapid twist in the line of argument, which Ida would find somewhat bewildering. "But, dear Miss Ida," she continued, "do leave off clutching at that chair arm when I'm lifting you up, and your eyes'll drop out of your head if you go on staring like that." Ida relaxed the nervous grasp to which she had been impelled by her energy on the subject of the pugs, let down her eyebrows, and submitted to be undressed. The least pleasant part of this ceremony may be comprised in the word curl papers. Ida's hair was dark and soft and smooth, but other little girls wore ringlets, and so this little girl must wear ringlets too. To that end her hair was every night put into curl papers, with much tight twisting and sharp jerking, and Ida slept upon an irregular layer of small paper parcels, which made pillows a mockery. With all this, however, a damp day or a good romp would sometimes undo the night's work, to the great disgust of Nurse. In her last place, the young lady's hair had curled with a damp brush, as Ida well knew, and Nurse made so much of her own grievance in having to use the curl papers that no place was left for Ida's grievance in having to sleep upon them. She submitted this night, therefore, as other nights, in patience, and sat swinging her feet and accommodating her head to the sharp tugs, which always seemed to come from unexpected quarters. Perhaps, however, her mind may have been running a little upon grievances which made her say, "You know, Nursey, how you are always telling me I ought to be thankful for having things and not having things, and I wish you'd talk sense and not give way with your head so when I pull, Miss Ida," retorted Nurse. "Having things and not having things. I don't know what you mean." "Well, you know, Nursey, the other day when I said I didn't like bread and treacled so long before and soaked in, and you said I ought to be thankful that I had bread and treacle at all, and that I hadn't a wooden leg and to eat anything I could get, like the old sailor man at the corner. Well, do you know, I've thought of something I am so thankful for, and that is that I haven't a red screen to my bed. I really do think, Miss Ida," said Nurse, "that you'll go out of your mind some day with your outlandish fancies, and where you get them, I can't think. I'm sure I never put such things into your head." Ida laughed again. "Never mind, Nursey, it all belongs to the pug story. Am I done now? And when you've tucked me up, please, would you mind remembering to put the flower where I can see it when I wake?" Nurse did as she was asked, and Ida watched the hyacinth till she fell asleep, and she slept well. In the morning she took her old post at the window. The little old lady had never seemed so long in making her appearance, nor the bells so slow to begin. Chim chime, chim chime. There they were at last, and there was Mrs. Over the Way. She looked up, waved a bunch of snowdrops, and went after the bells. Ida kissed her hand and waved it over and over again, long after the little old lady was out of sight. "There's a kiss for you, dear Mrs. Over the Way," she cried, "and kisses for your flowers and your house and everything belonging to you, and for the bells and the church and everybody in it this morning, and—" But at this point of universal benevolence, Nurse carried her off to breakfast. The little old lady came to tea as before. She looked as well as ever, and Nurse was equally generous in the matter of tea and toast. Mrs. Overthaway told over again what Ida had missed in the story of Mrs. Moss, and Ida apologized with earnest distress for her uncivil conduct in falling asleep. "There I was snoring away when you were telling me such a delightful story," she exclaimed penitently. "Not snoring exactly, my dear," smiled the little old lady, "but you looked very happy." "I thought Nursey said so," said Ida. "Well, I'm very glad. It would have been too rude, and you know I don't know how it was, for I am so fond of stories. I like nothing so well." "Well, shall I try again?" said Mrs. Over the Way. "Perhaps I may find a more amusing one, and if it does put you to sleep, it won't do any harm. Indeed, I think the doctor will say I'm very good company for you." "You are very good, that I can tell him. said Ida fervently, "and please let it be about yourself again, if you can remember anything. I like true stories." "Talking of snoring," said Mrs. Overthaway, "reminds me of something that happened in my youth. And it is true, though, do you know it is a ghost story?" Ida danced in her chair. "That is just what I should like," she exclaimed. "Nurse has a ghost story belonging to a farmhouse, which she tells the housemaid, but she says she can't tell me till I am older, and I should so like to hear a ghost story if it isn't too horrid." "This ghost story isn't too horrid, I think," laughed the little old lady, "and if you will let me think a few minutes and then forgive my prosy way of telling it, you shall have it at once." There was a pause. The little old lady sat silent, and so sat Ida also, with her eyes intently fixed on Mrs. Overthaway's face, over which an occasional smile was passing. "It's about a ghost who snored," said the little old lady doubtfully. "Delicious," responded Ida. Mamma had gone downtown to shop. She had asked Nora to look after Jane Gladys, and Nora promised she would. But it was her afternoon for polishing the silver, so she stayed in the pantry and left Jane Gladys to amuse herself alone in the big sitting room upstairs. The little girl did not mind being alone, for she was working on her first piece of embroidery, a sofa pillow for Papa's birthday present. So she crept into the big bay window and curled herself up on the broad sill while she bent her brown head over her work. Soon the door opened and closed again, quietly. Jane Gladys thought it was Nora, so she didn't look up until she had taken a couple more stitches on a forget-me-not. Then she raised her eyes and was astonished to find a strange man in the middle of the room who regarded her earnestly. He was short and fat and seemed to be breathing heavily from his climb up the stairs. He held a work silk hat in one hand, and underneath his other elbow was tucked a good-sized book. He was dressed in a black suit that looked old and rather shabby, and his head was bald upon the top. "Excuse me," he said, while the child gazed at him in solemn surprise. "Are you Jane Gladys Brown?" "Yes, sir," she answered. Very good indeed," he remarked with a queer sort of smile. "I've had quite a hunt to find you, but I've succeeded at last." "How did you get in?" inquired Jane Gladys with a growing distrust of her visitor. "That is a secret," he said mysteriously. This was enough to put the girl on her guard. She looked at the man, and the man looked at her, and both looks were grave and somewhat anxious. "What do you want?" she asked, straightening herself up with a dignified air. "Ah, now we are coming to business," said the man briskly. "I'm going to be quite frank with you. To begin with, your father has abused me in a most ungentlemanly manner." Jane Gladys got off the window-sill and pointed her small finger at the door. "Leave this room immediately," she cried, her voice trembling with indignation. "My papa is the best man in the world. He never bust anybody." "Allow me to explain, please," said the visitor, without paying any attention to her request to go away. "Your father may be very kind to you, for you are his little girl, you know. But when he's downtown in his office, he's inclined to be rather severe, especially on book agents. Now I called on him the other day and asked him to buy the complete works of Peter Smith. And what do you suppose he did?" She said nothing. "Why?" continued the man with growing excitement. "He ordered me from his office and had me put out of the building by the janitor. What do you think of such treatment as that from the best papa in the world, eh?" "I think he was quite right," said Jane Gladys. "Oh, you do? Well," said the man, "I resolved to be revenged for the insult. So, as your father is big and strong and a dangerous man, I have decided to be revenged upon his little girl." Jane Gladys shivered. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to present you with this book," he answered, taking it from under his arm. Then he sat down on the edge of a chair, placed his hat on the rug, and drew a fountain pen from his vest pocket. "I'll write your name in it," said he. "How do you spell Gladys?" "Gladys," she replied. "Thank you. Now this," he continued, rising and handing her the book with a bow, "is my revenge for your father's treatment of me. Perhaps he'll be sorry he didn't buy the complete works of Peter Smith. Goodbye, my dear." He walked to the door, gave her another bow, and left the room, and Jane Gladys could see that he was laughing to himself as if very much amused. When the door had closed behind the queer little man, the child sat down in the window again and glanced at the book. It had a red and yellow cover, and the word "Thingamajigs" was across the front in big letters. Then she opened it, curiously, and saw her name written in black letters upon the first white leaf. He was a funny little man, she said to herself thoughtfully. She turned the next leaf and saw a big picture of a clown, dressed in green and red and yellow, and having a very white face with 3-cornered spots of red on each cheek and over the eyes. While she looked at this, the book trembled in her hands. The leaf crackled and creaked, and suddenly the clown jumped out of it and stood upon the floor beside her, becoming instantly as big as any ordinary clown. After stretching his arms and legs and yawning in a rather impolite manner, he gave a silly chuckle and said, "This is better. You don't know how cramped one gets standing so long upon a page of flat paper." Perhaps you can imagine how startled Jane Gladys was, and how she stared at the clown who had just leaped out of the book. "You didn't expect anything of this sort, did you?" he asked, leering at her in clown fashion. Then he turned around to take a look at the room, and Jane Gladys laughed in spite of her astonishment. "What amuses you?" demanded the clown. "Why, the back of you is all white," cried the girl. "You're only a clown in front of you." Quite likely, he returned in an annoyed tone. The artist made a front view of me. He wasn't expected to make the back of me, for that was against the page of the book. But it makes you look so funny, said Jane Gladys, laughing until her eyes were moist with tears. The clown looked sulky and sat down upon a chair so she couldn't see his back. I'm not the only thing in the book, he remarked crossly. This reminded her to turn another page, and she had scarcely noted that it contained the picture of a monkey when the animal sprang from the book with a great crumpling of paper and landed upon the window seat beside her. Hee 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 hee, chattered the creature, springing to the girl's shoulder and then to the center table. This is great fun. Now I can be a real monkey instead of a picture of one. Real monkeys can't talk, said Jane Gladys reprovingly. How do you know? Have you ever been one yourself? Inquired the animal. And then he laughed loudly, and the clown laughed too, as if he enjoyed the remark. The girl was quite bewildered by this time. She thoughtlessly turned another leaf, and before she had time to look twice, a gray donkey leaped from the book and stumbled from the window seat to the floor with a great clatter. You're clumsy enough, I'm sure, said the child indignantly, for the beast had nearly upset her. Clumsy? And why not? Demanded the donkey with angry voice. If the fool artist had drawn you out of perspective as he did me, I guess you'd be clumsy yourself. What's wrong with you? Asked Jane Gladys. My front and rear legs on the left side are nearly 6 inches too short. That's what's the matter. If that artist didn't know how to draw properly, why did he try to make a donkey at all? I don't know, replied the child, seeing an answer was expected. I can hardly stand up, grumbled the donkey, and the least little thing will topple me over. Don't mind that, said the monkey, making a spring at the chandelier and swinging from it by his tail until Jane Gladys feared he would knock all the globes off. The same artist has made my ears as big as that clown's, and everyone knows a monkey hasn't any ears to speak of, much less to draw. He should be prosecuted, remarked the clown gloomily. I haven't any back. Jane Gladys looked from one to the other with a puzzled expression upon her sweet face, and turned another page of the book. Swift as a flash there sprang over her shoulder a tawny, spotted leopard, which landed upon the back of a big leather armchair and turned upon the others with a fierce movement. The monkey climbed to the top of the chandelier and chattered with fright. The donkey tried to run and straightway tipped over on his left side. The clown grew paler than ever, but he sat still in his chair and gave a low whistle of surprise. The leopard crouched upon the back of the chair, lashed his tail from side to side, and glared at all of them by turns, including Jane Gladys. Which of us are you going to attack first? Asked the donkey, trying hard to get upon his feet again. I can't attack any of you, snarled the leopard. The artist made my mouth shut so I haven't any teeth, and he forgot to make my claws. But I'm a frightful-looking creature nevertheless, am I not? Oh, yes, said the clown indifferently. "I suppose you're frightful looking enough. But if you have no teeth nor claws, we don't mind your looks at all." This so annoyed the leopard that he growled horribly, and the monkey laughed at him. Just then the book slipped from the girl's lap, and as she made a movement to catch it, one of the pages near the back opened wide. She caught a glimpse of a fierce grizzly bear looking at her from the page, and quickly threw the book from her. It fell with a crash in the middle of the room, but beside it stood the great grizzly, who had wrenched himself from the page before the book closed. "Now," cried the leopard from his perch, "you'd better look out for yourselves. You can't laugh at him as you did at me. The bear has both claws and teeth." "Indeed I have," said the bear in a low, deep, growling voice. "And I know how to use them too. If you read in that book, you'll find I'm described as a horrible, cruel, and remorseless grizzly whose only business in life is to eat up little girls, shoes, dresses, ribbons, and all. And then the author says, I smack my lips and glory in my wickedness." "That's awful," said the donkey, sitting upon his haunches and shaking his head sadly. "What do you suppose possessed the author to make you so hungry for girls? Do you eat animals also?" "The author does not mention my eating anything but little girls," replied the bear. "Very good," remarked the clown, drawing a long breath of relief. "You may begin eating Jane Gladys as soon as you wish. She laughed because I had no back. And she laughed because my legs are out of perspective," brayed the donkey. "But you also deserve to be eaten," screamed the leopard from the back of the leather chair. "For you laughed and poked fun at me because I had no claws nor teeth. Don't you suppose, Mr. Grizzly, you could manage to eat a clown, a donkey, and a monkey after you finish the girl?" "Perhaps so, and a leopard into the bargain," growled the bear. "It will depend on how hungry I am, but I must begin on the little girl first because the author says I prefer girls to anything." Jane Gladys was much frightened on hearing this conversation, and she began to realize what the man meant when he said he gave her the book to be revenged. Surely Papa would be sorry he hadn't bought the complete works of Peter Smith when he came home and found his little girl eaten up by a grizzly bear, shoes, dress, ribbons, and all. The bear stood up and balanced himself on his rear legs. "This is the way I look in the book," he said. "Now watch me eat the little girl." He advanced slowly toward Jane Gladys, and the monkey, the leopard, the donkey, and the clown all stood around in a circle and watched the bear with much interest. But before the grizzly reached her, the child had a sudden thought and cried out, "Stop! You mustn't eat me. It would be wrong." "Why?" asked the bear in surprise. "Because I own you. You're my private property," she answered. "I don't see how you make that out," said the bear in a disappointed tone. "Why, the book was given to me. My name's on the front leaf, and you belong by rights in the book, so you mustn't dare to eat your owner." The grizzly hesitated. "Can any of you read?" he asked. "I can," said the clown. "Then see if she speaks the truth. Is her name really in the book?" The clown picked it up and looked at the name. "It is," said he. "Jane Gladys Brown," and written quite plainly in big letters. The bear sighed. "Then of course I can't eat her," he decided. "That author is as disappointing as most authors are. But he's not as bad as the artist," exclaimed the donkey, who was still trying to stand up straight. "The fault lies with yourselves," said Jane Gladys severely. "Why didn't you stay in the book where you were put?" The animals looked at each other in a foolish way, and the clown blushed under his white paint. "Really," began the bear, and then he stopped short. The doorbell rang loudly. "It's Mama!" cried Jane Gladys, springing to her feet. "She's come home at last. Now, you stupid creatures." But she was interrupted by them all making a rush for the book. There was a swish and a whir and a rustling of leaves, and an instant later the book lay upon the floor, looking just like any other book, while Jane Gladys's strange companions had all disappeared. This story should teach us to think quickly and clearly upon all occasions. For had Jane Gladys not remembered that she owned the bear, he probably would have eaten her before the bell rang. In all fairyland, there is no more mischievous a person than Tanko-Mankie the yellow Ryle. He flew through the city one afternoon, quite invisible to mortal eyes, but seeing everything himself, and noticed a figure of a wax lady standing behind the big plate glass window of Mr. Floman's department store. The wax lady was beautifully dressed, and extended in her stiff left hand was a card bearing the words, "Rare bargain. This stylish costume imported from Paris. Former price $20, reduced to only $19.98. This impressive announcement had drawn before the window a crowd of women shoppers, who stood looking at the wax lady with critical eyes. Tanko-Mankie laughed to himself, the low, gurgling little laugh that always means mischief. Then he flew close to the wax figure and breathed twice upon its forehead. From that instant the dummy began to live, but so dazed and astonished was she at the unexpected sensation that she continued to stand stupidly staring at the women outside and holding out the placard as before. The Ryle laughed again and flew away. Anyone but Tanko-Mankie would have remained to help the wax lady out of the troubles that were sure to overtake her. But this naughty elf thought it rare fun to turn the inexperienced lady loose in a cold and heartless world, and leave her to shift for herself. Fortunately, it was almost 6 o'clock when the dummy first realized that she was alive. And before she had collected her new thoughts and decided what to do, a man came around and drew down all the window shades, shutting off the view from the curious shoppers. Then the clerks and cashiers and floor walkers and cash girls went home, and the store was closed for the night, although the sweepers and scrubbers remained to clean the floors for the following day. The window inhabited by the wax lady was boxed in, like a little room, one small door being left at the side for the window trimmer to creep in and out of. So the scrubbers never noticed that the dummy, when left to herself, dropped the placard to the floor and sat down upon a pile of silks to wonder who she was, where she was, and how she happened to be alive. For you must consider, dear reader, that in spite of her size and her rich costume, in spite of her pink cheeks and fluffy yellow hair, this lady was very young, no older in reality than a baby born but half an hour. All she knew of the world was contained in the glimpse she had secured of the busy street facing her window. All she knew of people lay in the actions of the group of women which had stood before her on the other side of the window pane and criticized the fit of her dress or remarked upon its stylish appearance. So she had little enough to think about, and her thoughts moved somewhat slowly. Yet one thing she really decided upon, and that was not to remain in the window and be insolently stared at by a lot of women who were not nearly so handsome or well-dressed as herself. By the time she reached this important conclusion, it was after midnight, but dim lights were burning in the big deserted store. So she crept through the door of her window and walked down the long aisles, pausing now and then to look with much curiosity at the wealth of finery confronting her on every side. When she came to the glass cases filled with trimmed hats, she remembered having seen upon the heads of the women in the street similar creations. So she selected one that suited her fancy and placed it carefully upon her yellow locks. I won't attempt to explain what instinct it was that made her glance into a nearby mirror to see if the hat was straight, but this she certainly did. It didn't correspond with her dress very well, but the poor thing was too young to have much taste in matching colors. When she reached the glove counter, she remembered that gloves were also worn by the women she had seen. She took a pair from the case and tried to fit them upon her stiff, wax-coated fingers. But the gloves were too small and ripped in the seams. Then she tried another pair and several others as well. But hours passed before she finally succeeded in getting her hands covered with a pair of pea-green kids. Next, she selected a parasol from a large and varied assortment in the rear of the store. Not that she had any idea what it was used for, but other ladies carried such things, so she also would have one. When she again examined herself critically in the mirror, she decided her outfit was now complete, and to her inexperienced eyes there was no perceptible difference between her and the women who had stood outside the window. Whereupon she tried to leave the store, but found every door fast locked. The wax lady was in no hurry. She inherited patience from her previous existence. Just to be alive and to wear beautiful clothes was sufficient enjoyment for her at present. So she sat down upon a stool and waited quietly until daylight. When the janitor unlocked the door in the morning, the wax lady swept past him and walked with stiff but stately strides down the street. The poor fellow was so completely whuckered at seeing the well-known wax lady leave her window and march away from the store that he fell over in a heap and only saved himself from fainting by striking his funny bone against the doorstep. When he recovered his wits, she had turned the corner and disappeared. The wax lady's immature mind had reasoned that, since she had come to life, her evident duty was to mix with the world and do whatever other folks did. She could not realize how different she was from people of flesh and blood, nor did she know she was the first dummy that had ever lived, or that she owed her unique experience to Tanko-Mankey's love of mischief. So ignorance gave her a confidence in herself that she was not justly entitled to. It was yet early in the day, and the few people she met were hurrying along the streets. Many of them turned into restaurants and eating houses, and following their example, the wax lady also entered one and sat upon a stool before a lunch counter. "Coffee and rolls," said a shop girl on the next stool. "Coffee and rolls," repeated the dummy, and soon the waiter placed them before her. Of course she had no appetite, as her constitution, being mostly wood, did not require food, but she watched the shop girl and saw her put the coffee to her mouth and drink it. Therefore the wax lady did the same, and the next instant was surprised to feel the hot liquid trickling out between her wooden ribs. The coffee also blistered her wax lips, and so disagreeable was the experience that she arose and left the restaurant, paying no attention to the demands of the waiter for 20 cents, mum. Not that she intended to defraud him, but the poor creature had no idea what he meant by 20 cents, mum. As she came out, she met the window trimmer at Floman's store. The man was rather nearsighted, but seeing something familiar in the lady's features, he politely raised his hat. The wax lady also raised her hat, thinking it the proper thing to do, and the man hurried away with a horrified face. Then a woman touched her arm and said, "Beg pardon, ma'am, but there's a price mark hanging on your dress behind." "Yes, I know," replied the wax lady stiffly. "It was originally $20, but it's been reduced to $19.98. The woman looked surprised at such indifference and walked on. Some carriages were standing at the edge of the sidewalk, and seeing the dummy hesitate, a driver approached her and touched his cap. "Cab, ma'am?" he asked. "No," said she, misunderstanding him. "I'm wax." "Oh!" he exclaimed, and looked after her wonderingly. "Here's your morning paper," yelled a newsboy. "Mine, did you say?" she asked. "Sure. Chronicle, Quirer, Republican Spatch. What'll you have?" "What are they for?" inquired the wax lady simply. "Why, to read, o' course. All the news, you know." She shook her head and glanced at a paper. "It looks all speckled and mixed up," she said. "I'm afraid I can't read." Ever been to school? Asked the boy, becoming interested. No. What's school? She inquired. The boy gave her an indignant look. Say, he cried, you're just a dummy, that's what ye are, and ran away to seek a more promising customer. I wonder that he means, thought the poor lady. Am I really different in some way from all the others? I look like them certainly, and I try to act like them. Yet that boy called me a dummy and seemed to think I acted queerly. This idea worried her a little, but she walked on to the corner where she noticed a streetcar stop to let some people on. The wax lady, still determined to do as others did, also boarded the car and sat down quietly in a corner. After riding a few blocks, the conductor approached her and said, "Fare, please." "What's that?" she inquired innocently. "Your fare," said the man impatiently. She stared at him stupidly, trying to think what he meant. "Come, come," growled the conductor. "Either pay up or get off." Still she did not understand, and he grabbed her rudely by the arm and lifted her to her feet. But when his hand came in contact with the hard wood of which her arm was made, the fellow was filled with surprise. He stooped down and peered into her face, and, seeing it was wax instead of flesh, he gave a yell of fear and jumped from the car, running as if he had seen a ghost. At this, the other passengers also yelled and sprang from the car, fearing a collision, and the motorman, knowing something was wrong, followed suit. The wax lady, seeing the others run, jumped from the car last of all, and stepped in front of another car coming at full speed from the opposite direction. She heard cries of fear and of warning on all sides, but before she understood her danger, she was knocked down and dragged for half a block. When the car was brought to a stop, a policeman reached down and pulled her from under the wheels. Her dress was badly torn and soiled. Her left ear was entirely gone, and the left side of her head was caved in. But she quickly scrambled to her feet and asked for her hat. This a gentleman had already picked up, and when the policeman handed it to her and noticed the great hole in her head and the hollow place it disclosed, the poor fellow trembled so frightfully that his knees actually knocked together. Why, ma'am, you're killed," he gasped. "What does it mean to be killed?" asked the wax lady. The policeman shuddered and wiped the perspiration from his forehead. "You're it," he answered with a groan. The crowd that had collected were looking upon the lady wonderingly, and a middle-aged gentleman now exclaimed, "Why, she's wax." "Wax?" echoed the policeman. "Certainly, she's one of those dummies they put in the windows," declared the middle-aged man. The people who had collected shouted, "You're right! That's what she is. She's a dummy!" "Are you?" inquired the policeman sternly. The wax lady did not reply. She began to fear she was getting into trouble, and the staring crowd seemed to embarrass her. Suddenly a bootblack attempted to solve the problem by saying, "You guys is all wrong. Can a dummy talk? Can a dummy walk? Can a dummy live? Hush, murmured the policeman. Look here. And he pointed to the hole in the lady's head. The newsboy looked, turned pale, and whistled to keep himself from shivering. A second policeman now arrived, and after a brief conference it was decided to take the strange creature to headquarters. So they called a hurry-up wagon, and the damaged wax lady was helped inside and driven to the police station. There the policeman locked her in a cell and hastened to tell Inspector Mugg their wonderful story. Inspector Mugg had just eaten a poor breakfast and was not in a pleasant mood. So he roared and stormed at the unlucky policemen, saying they were themselves dummies to bring such a fairy tale to a man of sense. He also hinted that they had been guilty of intemperance. The policeman tried to explain, but Inspector Mugg would not listen, and while they were still disputing in rushed Mr. Floman, the owner of the department store. "I want a dozen detectives at once, Inspector," he cried. "What for?" demanded Mugg. "One of the wax ladies has escaped from my store and eloped with a $19.98 costume, a $4.23 hat, a $2.19 parasol, and a 76-cent pair of gloves, and I want her arrested." While he paused for breath, the inspector glared at him in amazement. "Is everybody going crazy at the same time?" he inquired sarcastically. "How could a wax dummy run away?" "I don't know, but she did. When my janitor opened the door this morning, he saw her run out." "Why didn't he stop her?" asked Mugg. "He was too frightened. But she's stolen my property, Your Honor, and I want her arrested," declared the storekeeper. The inspector thought for a moment. "You wouldn't be able to prosecute her," he said, "for there's no law against dummies stealing." Mr. Floman sighed bitterly. "Am I to lose that $19.98 costume and the $4.25 hat and—" "By no means," interrupted Inspector Mugg. "The police of this city are ever prompt to act in defense of our worthy citizens. We have already arrested the wax lady, and she is locked up in cell number 16. You may go there and recover your property if you wish, but before you prosecute her for stealing, you'd better hunt up a law that applies to dummies." "All I want," said Mr. Floman, "is that $19.98 costume and—" "Come along," interrupted the policeman. "I'll take you to the cell." But when they entered number 16, they found only a lifeless dummy lying prone upon the floor. Its wax was cracked and blistered, its head was badly damaged, and the bargain costume was dusty, soiled, and much bedraggled. For the mischief-loving Tanko-Mankie had flown by and breathed once more upon the poor wax lady, and in that instant her brief life ended. "It's just as I thought," said Inspector Mugg, leaning back in his chair contentedly. "I knew all the time the thing was a fake. It seems sometimes as though the whole world would go crazy if there wasn't some level-headed man around to bring 'em to their senses. Dummies are wood and wax, and that's all there is of 'em." That may be the rule, whispered the policeman to himself, but this one were a dummy as lived. And now as we come to the end of this session, if you're still awake, I would like you to feel the calm you've created within yourself. You've given your mind and body such a beautiful gift, a moment to simply be. Let that sense of peace stay with you as you move through the rest of your night. If you'd like, you can stay here a little longer.